Hey, what's up? It's Jake, and I'm here to talk to you about how to set up different environments and isolating your state files. So, I have this wonderful drawing tool that I paid a lot of money for that we're going to use, and I'm just going to show you kind of the way we're doing things now. We have this state file, right? And you've got state here, state file, okay? And this works for prod, stage, test, and dev, whatever. The problem with this is if you have state in prod that's different than state in dev, your state file is going to get all jacked up and it's not isolated. And you could really mess up your whole environment by doing this. So the solution is to make a dev, a test, a stage, and a prod state file. Okay, dev, test, stage, prod. Nobody ever said I was here because of my art. So there's a couple ways to manage this. These are called bulkheads. Okay, so we're instead of having one file that manages all of our environments, we're gonna have separate files, and you should have like separate branches, right? So you'd have a dev branch that has a state file, a test branch, a stage branch, prod branch, etc., with different state files. And instead of defining all your environment variables in a single file, you would define them each in a separate set of configuration. So it's completely isolated. You can't mess up this prod environment if you're using a dev state file. And there's really two ways you can isolate that. And the first way is to use a workspace. And the second way is like we're saying here with file layout. I like the file layout better myself because I don't trust people. But let's take a look at the code and you can see what I'm talking about here. So I just created this remote backend AWS directory, and in it has like an EC2 instance. It's got a security group, an elastic IP, and it just makes a simple instance. And there's a bucket in there and a DynamoDB table. So if I want to make this a dev environment or a prod environment, well, how do I know where I'm at, right? So the backend config that I have defines where this lives, right? And what you would need to do is you would need to initialize each environment with a different backend. So if I have well, I'll just show you. So I have this initialized backend, and if I run a Terraform apply, it runs and it's no problem. But where am I at? So if I go Terraform Workspace show, unless you've been working with this, you should get back default. Okay. So the default workspace stores your state file exactly wherever you specify in your key configuration, right? Okay, just stay with me here. So let's say we make a new workspace. So if I go Terraform Workspace new, and I'm going to name it dev. Okay. So now I have going. You are now on new empty workspace. Okay, so now if I do workspace show, I'm in the dev workspace. Okay, so if I do a Terraform plan, you can go see how this works. You're going to see something happen here. Releasing state file, yada yada yada, and it's pointing to the regular place, right? So this one's pretty good. There's no issues, but you'll notice this, everything's green, right? These resources already exist. So because I'm in a different workspace, it says, hey, none of this actually exists because it only exists in the state file defined in the default workspace. Okay. So if your state files in each workspace are isolated from each other, then you're able to kind of maneuver that however you want. But notice we're still using the same file, so that's kind of dangerous too. Terraform isn't using the state file in the default workspace, therefore it doesn't see the EC2 since it's already there. So if I apply it, it's going to make a totally new thing. If I were to make another workspace, like Terraform Workspace new test, and then it's going to go, hey, now I'm on the test. Let's show. Now I'm in the test workspace. If I run a Terraform plan, it's also going to say, hey, I have a whole bunch of new stuff that I need to build because none of this exists, right? I'm going to add 5 new things. And it's like, holy crap. So now we've got the ability to isolate using different workspaces. Okay, and you can switch with a select. So you can go Terraform Workspace select default, for example. Okay, so now I'm in default, Terraform apply, Terraform plan. And let's see what happens. So now that I'm back in the default workspace, again, same configuration, it found the state file on the back end and it was able to compare them and say, hey, I don't need to make anything. So let's select dev and see what happens if I actually do an apply. So let's do a Terraform apply. In our dev workspace, and it's up to you, the developer or the DevOps engineer, whatever you're doing, to remember all of this and remember what workspace you're in. And it puts a lot of onus on people. Yeah, see these already exist. The security group and so you need completely different files now because I can't run this on main because the file is asking to create things that already exist, such as a DynamoDB table and a security group. Okay, so my personal opinion is to isolate via file layout. So if you put your Terraform config files for each environment in separate folders, like I've been doing for all of these projects, so if I have this is production, okay, let me do my default so I don't forget where I am. All right, so I'm in default. So if I had if I made a directory called, we'll just do workspace. This is a horrible name. Workspace dev, right? And then I'm going to make another one called workspace test. Okay, and then what I'm going to do is I'm going to copy my backend data, main outputs, providers, and variables files. And I'm going to make a workspace dev, paste workspace test, paste, boom. Now, let's go to workspace dev. I can have a different remote backend. Okay, so like, well then how do you do that, right? So when you're initially creating a file layout, you have to use different authentication mechanisms for access control, right? So each environment could live in a separate AWS account. It could have a separate S3 bucket as a backend, et cetera, et cetera. So if I go to dev, for example, and I'm looking at like the variables for dev, and I just add dev at the end of this, right? Save that, and then I go to variables for test. I add test at the end of that. That's my bucket name. My DynamoDB name, I'm going to say test. And then my DynamoDB name for dev, I'm going to say dev. And then I go main for dev, and I go, all right, so this is all going to be the same. My security group, we're going to call this dev. and the bucket is dev. I could use the bucket name. Terraform locks is dev, because they have to be unique, right, for the buckets. And then for main and test, I'm going to say the security group, SG test, Terraform bucket test, and the DynamoDB test. Okay, so now I have completely separate resources, and if I go now to the backend for dev, I can see it's going into this bucket. I could even do something like dev / Terraform state, right? Or I could do in a test, I could do / test / Terraform state, and I have completely separate folders. But I don't need to necessarily, and the reason for that, let me update this real quick and then I'm going to show you why, is because we have to declare a bucket. So for dev, if I'm using a dev bucket, then I don't need a folder because it's already in a dev bucket, right? So then if I go to test and I add the test bucket and I do the same thing, then it works out. So now if I'm in workspace dev, I need to do an init. So Terraform init, failure bucket does not exist. Fine. I should have built it before I did this. So let's go over to here. Let's grab this name, and I need a dev and a test. You know what? It's easier to do this way. AWS S3 make bucket S3 : / that. And then I'm going to do a dev as well. So much faster. Now, Terraform init. I don't practice any of this before I do it. Hopefully, because it helps. It's not like professional or whatever, but hopefully it helps to have a better understanding of how you might run into errors and solve them. Okay, so that's good. Let's run a Terraform plan. Again, I'm in workspace dev. I'm not in the regular one. Now, what workspace am I actually in? I named it workspace dev because I'm just showing you how to make it in an isolated file layout. I'm actually in the default workspace for the workspace dev folder, the directory. That's, I said, it's a horrible name. So I should probably name it something like, I don't know, whatever the app name is, dev, if I had an app name. Okay, cool. So let's run an apply and see what happens. Need to hold music right here. All right, yes, go forth, do the things. The bucket should already exist, and it'll fail if it needs to. If not, that's fine. Terraform lock for DynamoDB. And now when I go to here, I've got my buckets, state, dev test, and then let's go over to tables, and I've got a dev, which is great. All right, and it's going to create an instance, which takes a sec. So the idea is that if you're in a repo, you can have a separate repo, right, which technically is still just an isolated file, or you can have a single repo that has different branches, and the different branches with different files can have different configurations. So you really need to think about your strategy for branching and for merging and for locks and remote state when you're setting this up. You can't just like turn it on and then be like, okay, we're good. We're all remote backend and hi-fi and fancy. All right, cool, and that worked. And then if I wanted to, I could go ahead and do workspace test, Terraform init. Go ahead and grab this little provider, Terraform apply, and let this build while I go over the rest of this file layout. So this approach, you got separate folders, so it's clear which environment is which. Separate state files, separate. You can do separate authentication mechanisms. It's way less likely that you're going to screw something up. And I know a big like criticism of Terraform is just all this state and everybody stepping on top of each other. Maybe out of the box that's true. Out of the box that is definitely true. But there's some configuration things that you should be using. Controls using Sentinel, isolated file layouts or workspaces, and having remote locks and backend and things like that that are versioned and audited and monitored. All these things will lead to a much cleaner developer experience and a much smoother operations experience. So that would be my recommendation. You can kind of take it beyond environments to the component level. So if you have you could have a completely separate network topology and have all this point with a different live in a totally different VPC if you wanted to, or like I said, a totally different AWS account. So definitely recommend using different Terraform folders so you can have, and you see that's how I have mine set up. So in my repo, I have a Terraform directory or a Terraform repo. Like this is literally where's GitHub? Maybe I don't have it open. But anyways, it's literally like I did a git pull or a git clone of my Terraform repo. And then in that repo, I have all these separate directories. And in each directory, I have a completely separate AWS and Terraform backend configuration. So they're completely isolated from each other, which is really nice. And if we go take a look now at our tables, we should have a locks test. So now I've got locks on, and I should name this like prod, a locks prod table, a dev. So they're even isolated to different database tables in DynamoDB, as well as different state files with completely separate buckets. And these buckets can all have individual IAM permissions so that a developer could have carte blanche to go into the dev bucket all they want, but they wouldn't ever have access to anything else. So that's kind of how I would do it. A typical project, you'd have like let's say you're starting a new project. I'll put it in my local folder. Project 1. All right, we'll call it project 1. So in here, I'd probably have, oops, where is my, local. Local. Yeah, okay. So if you go to project 1, I would probably do like make dir like a stage, a prod. Okay. I might even have like some kind of like a make dir global. Oops. Make dir global. Maybe a if there's a management layer or something like that. There we go. What am I making? Okay, I already made all this. So then in this environment, so I have this project, and in that project, I've got separate directories. I mean, I can make a dev one too. And in that directory, I could go, okay, let me go to dev, right? So in dev, I want to have my own VPC. I want to have services. I want to have storage, and maybe that's it, right? So that's all I have in my dev folder, but maybe I also have in my global folder, I might have like a directory for IAM and S3. So if there's a global S3 bucket that everybody's using, I can put that in there. And this wouldn't be like for lock files, but it would definitely be for like content, like static site content. So you can use the same S3 content, but yeah. But this gives you the option to have separated environments with separated networks, separated storage, separated services, and global variables, if you will, for security, storage, any kind of management stuff you might need, bastion hosts, pipelines, things like that. And you can kind of lay that out like that, and it would make a little bit more sense. So every component should have like variables and outputs, a main file. Kind of like you see, like I do variables, outputs, main. I put my providers over here too, just because sometimes I don't like having extra stuff when it gets really long. So I put my data back here too as well. That's something that I personally like to do. And I have a backend file just so it's easy to find. So I like using, I'd rather have 6 files than one 200 line long Terraform file, main.tf file. So that's just me. Um, anywhere you can avoid copying and pasting, basically use variables everywhere you can, and that's pretty much it. So if you have any questions, let me know, and if not, then I'll go ahead and leave it to you to figure out how you want to start laying this out and designing your environment to make sense for you to have isolated remote backend using file layout or workspaces. And I recommend using file layout. And yeah, so let me know if you have any questions. And if not, then I will see you next time.